Hello everyone, my name is Allison Futrell. This is my video assignment for computer ethics. And for my topic, my broad topic, it will be on intellectual property. This is a chapter we'll be focusing on later in the modules. And specifically for my topic, I want to discuss cyber squatting and how the act of cyber squatting can affect individuals' intellectual property rights. So, for those of you who don't know what intellectual property is, this is the ownership of intangible items. So, a really good example of this is, of course, there's copyrights, there's trademarks. But let's say that you walk into a bookstore and you purchase a book, which people do it every day. But you cannot use the ideas, the plot, the characters from that book to create your own ideas. So this is what intellectual property is, and it's just a way to keep people from taking ownership of something that it's not theirs in the first place. So for my more specific topic of cyber squatting, this is an act of taking over a domain name. So this infringes upon rights of other individuals, especially if they do have intellectual property within their website that is something for their own use and not for others. A really good way to kind of sum up cyber squatters is to think about the term squatters, such as people who reside in a residence that they do not own. Um, they really don't have the right to do it, but there's a lot of laws, like in different states, that make it really hard to um, get the access of the residents back in control of the original owner. And this is kind of how cyber squatting is. It's a lot of details, and if something like this does happen to happen to an individual where their domain name is purchased, or there's a domain name that's very similar to theirs, it can cause a lot of issues that can start to kind of come down to whether litigation needs to be used, or it could be as simple as just swapping the domain names back so they can have their intellectual property back. Um, Another really good example for specifically cyber squatting is if a individual owns a domain name and they have their works that they've been writing, such as, biographies or whatever books they're writing on their website. If a cyber squatter happens to purchase that domain name, let's say, because of domain names, they expire after a certain amount of time. If the cyber squatter happens to purchase this name, then they can use it for, for their profits, even though it's not their property in the first place. So, for my first argument, I'd like to discuss how laws should be stricter in regards to creating domain names, and how the act that was put into place in 1999 creates a certain degree into which domain names can be created, specifically the syntax. A really good example for this is in the 90s, Disney, of course, a large corporation that usually has crowds of younger people that enjoy their content. And in the 90s, there was an individual who created a domain name that was very similar to Disney's. The only difference was there was one letter that was different than Disney's website. And so, of course, this came with issues because there was a younger individual who somehow accessed this website that was very similar to Disney's name, only to find out that this website had inappropriate content on it, such as images and photos that are not appropriate for a younger person to be looking at. And because of issues like this, the act that was put into place kind of puts in those boundaries to not allow things like this to happen. So, the act that I'm mentioning is the Anti-Cybersquatting Consumer Act of 1999. This was really put into place, of course, for one of the issues mentioned earlier with syntax, and it's really just to protect the consumers, specifically American businesses, and it promotes the growth of their market and their online commerce, and just prevents cyber squatting from happening in the future with issues that are very similar to um, their domain name. Another really good one is, let's say people are purchasing from www.barnesandnoble.com. Well, there was an individual, not specifically for this domain name, but they, instead of using www dot, they only used the first three W's and didn't put a period after the so. And of course, this caused issues because this was an example of how something so simple can be missed by consumers, and it could lead to consumers purchasing items that are not really what they're purchasing, or it could be a scam website to where their credit card information is being used. And in regards to that, a very interesting fact is cyber squatting is actually not a criminal activity. There are no laws put into place as of right now that can pursue cyber squatters and, you know, take them to prison. There's no laws in regards to that. But I will be discussing a little later about how there are certain fines that are put into place for cyber squatters and how those are going to be used against the actions that are possibly intellectual property, um, like using their intellectual property and things like that. For my second argument, I'd like to discuss how I'm for laws becoming stricter against cyber squatters that infringe upon intellectual property rights of individuals who had the ownership of the domain name in the first place. So, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers adopted a policy that is the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Policy. And what this does is it's very similar to the act put into place by Congress, but the main difference is with the policy under the Internet Corporation, there aren't fees and litigation process or a lot of paperwork that has to be done. So this this example or this policy is really good for small business owners or individuals who have intellectual property in their domain or in their website, but they may not have the financial obligations to afford the litigation that is to come with having to deal with cyber squatters, such as, the paperwork alone could take years at a time, and usually people who can afford to process the litigation that comes with cyber squatting go for the act instead of the policy. So large corporations such as Disney, really good example again. Something's to happen with their domain now, since that act was put into place, they can afford that litigation process, and they can deal with the years of work because they have the lawyers to deal with it. They have the financial or financial dependency to do things like that, whereas the small business owners do not. So that policy was put into place for more specifically those individuals. A really good example of a trademark or intellectual property being violated would be, I worked for a retail company that has a website that is used, of course, all around the world, but mainly their locations are in the United States. And there was an incident to where pretty much a cyber squatter did use the domain name and changed just a couple letters around and added a very short, like, word at the end of the domain name. And the entire time I was there, we would receive phone calls about this website and how it looked just like our real website, but I would ask them, what does the URL say? What does the domain name say? And they would read it back to me. And of course, it was very, very similar, but it had some very small changes to it that not everyone would notice right away. And of course, what came with this was a lot of women were confused by it because this had to do with a large clearance. And of course, the retail store I worked at didn't hardly ever run sales. So for them to see a sale this big, 70% off, 80% off, closing sale, they were running to the website and purchasing just to find out that it was a scam. And of course, they had to go through all the craziness of being reimbursed for that. And so, stuff like that, where trademarks are being used, logos are being used to deceive the consumers, is why like policies such as the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution was put into place, and of course, the act by Congress was put into place. For my third argument, I'd like to discuss how laws should be stricter on how cyber squatters are fined. As mentioned earlier, cyber squatting is not a criminal activity, but there is certain ways to impugn fines onto the cyber squatter. So for individuals who are taking control of a domain name, whether it was purchased after expiration or it's one that is similar to another domain name, like similar syntax. Individuals are able to take the cyber squatter to court using the law or the act that was implemented in 1999, and through a lot of litigation work, a lot of financial obligations to that individual, they can receive compensation through the cyber squatter, anywhere in the range between 1,000 as the minimum and the maximum being 100,000. So these fines are to cover any damages that was brought onto the individual, whether that be intellectual property damages, or pretty much anything to do with the cyber squatter harming the business of that individual. So, for example, if a cyber squatter decided to take over a website that produces books, and of course the book has ideas, that's intellectual property, the individual who owned it in the first place, if they lose possession of the domain name, they can, through litigation process, of course, you use that to their extent to get their domain name back and have the damages paid um, through compensation from the cyber squatter. So, to bring this video assignment to a conclusion, I would like to ask if any of you have heard of any examples of this happening in your day-to-day life, or if you have a personal example of something like this happening. This is really good information to have just as something to know that could possibly happen for really anyone who has a domain name or has intellectual property within their website. One way that I wouldn't necessarily agree with cyber squatting, as this is for the most part an act that is taking over someone else's property, or in a way using a very similar name to kind of fool the consumer. But if a cyber squatter is using a domain name and it's not causing any harm or ill content, or the cyber squatter is not making any profit off of the domain name, then I don't really see an issue with the person owning that domain name. But of course, if it does come down to it and an individual wants to have the right to that domain name or they have intellectual property within that name. Of course, the litigation process or the policy should come through to allow that individual to keep their own rights. And but of course, this is really the only way I agree to this kind of act happening. Um, but for my three arguments, I think that gives enough reason as to why there should be stricter laws in cyber squatting, and how the how the litigation process goes along with not only the corporations that can actually afford to have something like this happen, but even the individuals who may not have a lot of financial obligate or dependencies for something like this to happen. So it's really good to have those laws and policies put into place for individuals, just in case something like this does happen. But I'd like to hear your comment or your question regarding this. Um, this act of cyber squatting, if you've ever heard of it before, or again, if it's something you've seen before. So, thank you so much for watching my video and have a great day or night.